As the United States' 16th president took office for a second term, the country was 3 years into an embittered, bloody battle. With the war drawing to a close, what America needed from its leader was someone who could not only restore the country, but repair the honor that had been blighted by bloodshed. Abraham Lincoln set a standard with his presidency that few men who held the office matched until the first decades of the 20th century. In a one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, Abraham Lincoln was born to Thomas and Nancy Lincoln on February 12, 1809. The man who would become America's 16th president was self-educated and grew to become a practicing country lawyer. Relocating to Illinois in 1832, Lincoln saw himself embroiled in politics in his first campaign for the Illinois General Assembly in a failed bid for a seat in the legislative body. A great orator, Lincoln could draw and rouse a crowd, but his lack of education and political connections may have been what kept him out of the governing body early in his career. 14 years later, however, Lincoln saw himself elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Promising to only serve one term, Lincoln then returned to the prairie, practicing law in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln's return to politics came in a series of speeches. The most notable was the Peoria speech of October 16, 1854, which was a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide whether their region would allow slavery. The speeches spoke out against senior Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who was responsible for the popular sovereignty aspect of the act. In 1860, Lincoln secured the Republican nomination and subsequently won the presidential election against his political rival Stephen Douglas. Lincoln entering office was seen by Southern secessionists as the final line in the sand and announced that they would leave the Union before Lincoln took office the following March. Indeed, soon after, the Confederate States of America was formed, and the country was at war. As the battles raged on, Lincoln saw the importance of removing the main point of contention, slavery, as a measure for reuniting the nation. His Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 utilized the Union Army in protecting escaped slaves, and the passage of the 13th Amendment saw federal law enacted banning slavery outright. While adept at political maneuvers, Lincoln proved an able leader of the Union Army as well. He delegated Ulysses S. Grant as commanding general of the Union Army and oversaw a successful naval blockade of Southern trade and supply routes. Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address, delivered 4.5 months after the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, saw Union soldiers defeat advancing Confederates, stressed the importance of not only the reunification of the country, but the unification of all men as equals, as stressed by the Constitution, written and adopted just over a century prior.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
The Civil War effectively ended April 9, 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The Herculean task of reconstruction now lay before the nation, but many were still incensed that not only had the Confederates lost and the slaves been freed, but now Lincoln began to advocate voting rights for free blacks. These factors seemed unacceptable to men like John Wilkes Booth. A popular actor who had served as a spy for the Confederates during the war, Booth initially planned to kidnap the president in exchange for the freedom of Confederate POWs. After the surrender, and attending a speech where Lincoln promoted voting rights for freed slaves, Booth was convinced that he had to kill the president. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln attended a production of Our American Cousin, a play, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. At 10:13 that night, Booth ended Lincoln's term in office. As the nation mourned its fallen president and the American Civil War drew to a close, Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, assumed the office as the 17th President of the United States. Born in Raleigh, North Carolina, in relative poverty, and apprenticing as a tailor in several frontier towns, Johnson served in the Tennessee House of Representatives and the state Senate before graduating to the United States House of Representatives. During Lincoln's first term, and in the midst of Civil War, the president named Johnson the military governor of Tennessee after the Union had retaken the state. When Lincoln ran for a second term, the war Democrat and Southern Unionist Andrew Johnson seemed like a natural choice for his running mate. In March of 1865, Lincoln and Johnson were sworn in as president and vice president, respectively, and the latter was reported to have given an inaugural speech while drunk. After Lincoln's assassination made him president, 6 weeks later, it became clear that Johnson's goal as president were at odds with that of Congress and that of a nation trying to rebuild and unify. Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to African American males, offered no protection to the former slaves during Reconstruction, and constantly overruled Congress when they refused to pass laws by representatives from states that passed black codes or laws that were put into place to deny freed slaves their civil liberties. Because of Johnson's outspoken criticism of Southern secessionists before his term as president, Congress naturally thought Johnson was the right man to unify the country. His actions while president, however, ran counter to his earlier stance. In 1868, impeachment proceedings against Johnson began, with 11 articles against the president, including the dismissal and invalid appointment of men into the Secretary of War office, conspiring to unlawfully seize full control of that office, and making speeches with intent to show disrespect for Congress. Johnson was the first sitting president to be impeached, and the last until Bill Clinton 131 years later. Like Clinton, Johnson was acquitted of all charges, but his reputation was forever damaged. He lost the nomination for president in the next election, and while he did become the only former president to serve in the Senate, Andrew Johnson's stance against federal rights for freed slaves has historians calling him one of the worst presidents. The 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, was a career soldier and a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a successful general responsible for winning the Civil War for the Union through victories at battles like Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, where his valor earned him the position of commander of all Union armies under order of President Abraham Lincoln. Grant's armies went toe-to-toe with Confederate General Robert E. Lee in what came to be known as the Overland Campaign, a series of brutal battles which resulted in the taking of Richmond in 1865 and the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. Ulysses S. Grant was easily elected president in 1868, and as president, continued what he saw as his mission held over from the Civil War: the eradication of any remaining Confederate nationalism and any facets of slavery. The general was relentless in this goal, passing the Force Acts to prosecute and jail members of the Ku Klux Klan and effectively disbanding that organization. Grant advocated civil service reform, the first president to do so, through creating the Civil Service Commission in 1871, and his 2 terms are credited with stabilizing the rebuilding nation. He saw the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution protecting the right to vote for African Americans, which saw the freedmen represented in the U.S. Congress for the very first time. Of the amendment, Grant said,
"I regard it as a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind, from the foundation of the government to the present day."
Initially, Grant had been listed among the worst presidents. However, a review of his foreign policy, which saw even-handedness and restraint in avoiding war with Britain and Spain, his work for civil rights, like the 15th Amendment and the prosecution of the Ku Klux Klan, and his efforts to maintain Indian peace, have all proven Grant a most worthy president. Another Civil War veteran, Rutherford B. Hayes, an Ohio attorney, was elected the 19th President of the United States in the election of 1876. While one of Hayes' goals was to continue the reconstruction of the country, and indeed he oversaw the final years of this process, his hotly contested election, in which he won the electoral but lost the popular vote, led to a compromise that divided the country politically all over again. The Compromise of 1877 saw that Southern Democrats accepted Hayes' presidential victory with the stipulation that federal Army intervention in Southern politics was brought to an end. In his inaugural address, Hayes sought to unify both the races and political parties of the country.
The President of the United States of necessity owes his election to office to the suffrage and zealous labors of a political party the members of which cherish with ardor and regard as of essential importance the principles of their party organization. But he should strive to be always mindful of the fact that he serves his party best, who serves the country best.
In his single term, Hayes promised not to run for re-election. He advocated a meritocratic government, equal civil rights, and improvement through education. He opposed silver money, insisting that the gold standard would protect the American economy. Hayes is credited mostly for restoring popular faith in the presidency. While Lincoln and Grant achieved much to rebuild the country, they were divisive figures that caused great political rifts. Hayes restored power, both literal and figurative, to the office that had been shaken with the Lincoln assassination.
Fellow citizens, we stand today upon an eminence which overlooks 100 years of national life, a century crowded with perils, but crowned with the triumphs of liberty and law. Before continuing the onward march, let us pause on this height for a moment to strengthen our faith and renew our hope by a glance at the pathway along which our people have traveled.
The 20th President of the United States was sworn in on March 4th, 1881. James Abram Garfield had long been anti-slavery and had served in the Union Army as a major general, fighting in the battles of Middle Creek, Chickamauga, and Shiloh. In 1862, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives, where he went on to serve 9 consecutive terms. In the year of what would be his final term as a representative, Garfield found himself a candidate for the president. He won the 1880 election as a compromise candidate after leading Republican candidates like Ulysses S. Grant and John Sherman failed to rouse enough support among their party. To this day, Garfield is the only sitting member of the House to be elected president. In his time as president, Garfield stressed an importance of civil rights. He advocated a universal education system funded by the federal government to ensure that freedmen received just as good an education as any white man. In his time in office, he also appointed several African Americans to federal positions, such as Frederick Douglass to Recorder of Deeds in Washington, Robert Elliott, Special Agent to the U.S. Treasury, and John M. Langston, Haitian Minister. Garfield was preparing to make a speech at his alma mater, Williams College, when walking through 6th Street Station in Baltimore, he was shot twice by Charles J. Guiteau. Guiteau sought a federal appointment as consul to Paris, but Garfield's Secretary of State, James Blaine, denied the man such an appointment due to his lack of qualifications and aggressive attitude in the seeking of the appointment. He had earlier been banned from the White House and believed that God told him that the Republican Party would be better off if Garfield was removed. Garfield died 2 months later due to complications from his wounds. At 200 days in office, the only shorter term is held by William Henry Harrison, although many could argue that Garfield accomplished more in his term than many presidents to come.
No man ever entered the presidency so profoundly and widely distrusted as Chester Alan Arthur, and no one ever retired more generally respected alike by political friend and foe.
Taking office in 1881, after the death of President James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur became the 21st President of the United States on September 19th of that year. Arthur entered office under political suspicion. After all, Garfield's assassin aligned himself with the kind of politics known to come from the New York City Republican machine, even declaring after his arrest that Arthur is president now. A lawyer from upstate New York, Arthur made his administration a key supporter of civil service reform, advocating and enforcing the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which made it federal law to award government jobs to those who qualified through application and testing, rather than nepotism or political favor. Arthur also saw the United States Navy reborn and won praise for vetoing the Rivers and Harbors Act, which would have excessively appropriated federal funds. His administration was marked only with the criticism that it failed to alleviate the federal budget surplus. A journalist wrote of Arthur's presidency, "No duty was neglected in his administration, and no adventurous project alarmed the nation." Arthur retired after failing to gain the nomination of his party in 1884, but poor health prevented a strong attempt to secure a spot for re-election. He returned to practice law in New York City and declined a request to run for Senate, preferring to work with his law firm, Arthur, Nevels, and Ransom.
When an election to office shall be the selection by the voters of one of their number to assume for a time a public trust, instead of his dedication to the profession of politics, when the holders of the ballot, quickened by a sense of duty, shall avenge truth betrayed and pledges broken, and when the suffrage shall be altogether free and uncorrupted, the full realization of a government by the people will be at hand.
Serving as the 22nd and 24th President of the United States, Grover Cleveland is so far the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office, as well as the lone Democrat elected in the period between 1861 and 1913. Being a fiscal conservative who opposed high tariffs, free silver, and subsidies to businesses, farmers, or veterans, won him the appeal of other conservatives, but these views hindered Cleveland's ability to handle impending economic crises. Indeed, it was the debate over tariff reduction that was key to his loss of the election of 1888. Republican candidate Benjamin Harrison defeated Cleveland in his first bid for re-election, but Cleveland's First Lady, Frances, was confident about Grover's return to the White House. It is reported that she told a White House staffer,
"Now, Jerry, I want you to take good care of all the furniture and ornaments in the house, for I want to find everything just as it is now when we come back again. We are coming back 4 years from today."
Frances' prediction came true. Harrison and the Congress he led were accused by voters of overspending, and Cleveland was welcomed back into the White House in the election of 1892. The grandson of the 9th president and record holder for shortest term served, William Henry Harrison, Benjamin Harrison, was elected the 23rd president of the United States in the election of 1888. It was later found that members of the Electoral College in New York and Indiana had sold their votes to the Republican Party, tipping the scales in Harrison's favor. Harrison, born in North Bend, Ohio, before settling in Indianapolis, Indiana, at age 21, had served as a brigadier general in the American Civil War and later served in the U.S. Senate for the state of Indiana. As president, Harrison's administration continued to develop a merit-based civil service program, creating the Dependent and Disability Pension Act in 1890. Harrison led what became known as the Billion-Dollar Congress because of federal spending reaching over $1 billion for the first time. While the spending was viewed as excessive by many of Harrison's opponents, and indeed it was the main issue that lost Harrison his re-election, the Congress was able to admit 6 new states to the Union, as well as passing the Land Revision Act, creating the National Forest Program, with Harrison authorizing the first at Yellowstone, Wyoming. Harrison's administration also championed civil rights. Harrison's attempts to pass the voting rights laws would be the last major attempt to ensure civil rights until the 1930s. Marking the beginning of over a third of a century of Republican presidencies, the 25th President of the United States, William McKinley, spurred economic growth and saw the Americans through to victory in the Spanish-American War. The last president to have served in the Civil War, McKinley ended his career in the Union Army as a brevet major and settled in Ohio to practice law. As president, he continued to push for protective tariffs to ensure domestic manufacturers were not competing with foreign companies and secured the Gold Standard Act. When Cuba entered into a war with Spain for independence, American sentiment favored the rebels. When the USS Maine was sent to Cuba in an effort to protect American lives and property in the country, an underwater mine destroyed the ship, leading Congress to declare war with Spain. Victory over Spain saw that the United States gained all of Spain's territory outside of Africa and Cuba and was promised its independence, although it initially remained under U.S. Army control. McKinley also saw the annexation of Hawaii in 1898, when it became a U.S. territory. On September 6, 1901, McKinley was assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist who had lost his job due to the Panic of 1893. He viewed McKinley as an oppressive threat, and as an anarchist, Czolgosz felt his duty to assassinate the president, calling him an enemy of the hard-working people, and later telling the police,
"It was in my heart. There was no escape for me. I could not have conquered it had my life been at stake. There were thousands of people in town on Tuesday. I heard it was President's Day. All those people seemed bowing to the great ruler. I made up my mind to kill that ruler."
Having been named vice president for McKinley's second term, Theodore Roosevelt was then named the 26th President of the United States in the wake of McKinley's assassination. At the time he was sworn in, Roosevelt was the youngest president ever at age 42. An experienced elected official at city, state, and federal levels, including Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Roosevelt was serving in that office when the Spanish-American War broke out. Rather than remain in Washington, Roosevelt chose to fight in Cuba, establishing the Rough Riders, the only one of 3 cavalry regiments raised during the conflict to see battle. Colonel Leonard Wood initially led the men with his second-in-command, Theodore Roosevelt. When Wood left to command the 2nd Cavalry Brigade, leaving Roosevelt in charge, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry became known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. A sickly youth, Roosevelt adopted a hard-living cowboy lifestyle and image and maintained a robust, masculine air throughout his life. Based on his bravery in the Mexican-American War, Roosevelt was elected vice president to William McKinley in 1900. As he assumed the office of the president, Roosevelt tried to move the Republican Party towards progressivism, with measures taken toward trust-busting and business regulation by the federal government. He promoted conservation, being an outdoorsman and a naturalist. Roosevelt was a driving force behind the completion of the Panama Canal. Before he took office, construction had stalled. Roosevelt orchestrated a deal that overtook the construction and bought the equipment and excavations made by the French and continued to develop the canal. Successful completion of the canal would revolutionize shipping routes, and American access to that route would prove to be invaluable. The man who once said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," helped to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Roosevelt was the first to win the prize while acting as United States President, and only two others have so far achieved this honor: Woodrow Wilson in 1919 and Barack Obama in 2009. Because of his political vigor and tenacity in office, Roosevelt became the first vice president to assume office after the death of his president, and to be re-elected for a second term in his own right. Before becoming the 27th President of the United States, William Howard Taft served as the United States Secretary of War under his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, as well as serving as the Governor General of the Philippines and the Provisional Governor of Cuba. A lawyer and one-time Solicitor General of the United States, and later Chief Justice, Taft broke with Roosevelt's charismatic politicking in favor of a staunch adherence to the rule of law during his presidential administration. While decisive and level-headed in his decision-making, Taft won the favor of few fellow politicians, journalists, or his constituents after failing to recognize any political ramifications of his decisions. While he considered himself a progressive, Taft, as a lawyer, was a slave to precedent, denying himself the flexibility and adroitness of Roosevelt. As Taft continued to make decisions that broke with his party's line, the 1912 presidential election saw Taft challenged by his predecessor, and the man to whom Taft had been unfavorably compared his whole presidency, Teddy Roosevelt. They vied for the Republican nomination for president in 1912, and Taft narrowly won the re-election spot. It was all for naught, however, for the Democrat Woodrow Wilson would go on to become the next president of the United States.
I always remember that America was established not to create wealth, though any nation must create wealth which is going to make an economic foundation for its life, but to realize a vision, to realize an ideal. America has put itself under bonds to the earth to discover and maintain liberty now among men. And if she cannot see liberty now with the clear, unerring vision she had at the outset, she has lost her title. She has lost her claim to the leadership and respect of the nations of the world.
The 28th president and second sitting president to secure the Nobel Peace Prize, Woodrow Wilson, was inaugurated President of the United States on March 4, 1913. A leader of the progressive movement, Wilson led an unparalleled legislative agenda, including the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Farm Loan Act, and the establishment of an income tax. The Adamson Act also passed, finally establishing an 8-hour workday for railroad construction laborers. Initially unsupportive of women's suffrage, Wilson bowed to public sentiment and soon advocated the woman's right to vote. when World War I raged in Europe, Wilson's foreign policy kept us out of war, and the president was narrowly elected for a second term in 1916 on that platform, although unrestricted German submarine warfare forced the United States to enter the war the following year, with Congress declaring war on Germany. After the war, Wilson helped to draft the Treaty of Versailles and created the League of Nations, for which he won the Nobel Peace Prize. But both the treaty and the League were dismissed by Congress and Wilson's Republican rivals as negligent to the rights of the United States when it came to the possible outbreak of another global war. The work which won Wilson the Peace Prize wound up becoming his political undoing. In a landslide election in 1920, the Republicans retook control of Congress and the White House.
The world needs to be reminded that all human ills are not curable by legislation, and that quantity of statutory enactment and excess of government offer no substitute for quality of citizenship. The problems of maintained civilization are not to be solved by a transfer of responsibility from citizenship to government, and no eminent page in history was ever drafted by the standards of mediocrity. More, no government is worthy of the name which is directed by influence on the one hand, or moved by intimidation on the other.
29th President Warren G. Harding promised a return to normalcy, or a return to life as it was before World War I, in his campaign for President of the United States. While Harding worked as an advocate for labor, minorities, and women, he has the dubious distinction of being involved in one of the first major political scandals and established a new normalcy of corruption and cronyism in politics. When elected, Harding selected the so-called best minds for his cabinet, but rewarded his campaign contributors and friends with powerful positions. Known as the Ohio Gang, this group orchestrated the infamous Teapot Dome scandal, whereby Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, was convicted of accepting bribes from private oil companies in a deal that leased Navy oil reserves to private companies at seemingly low rates and without any bidding from other companies. While corruption came to taint Harding's legacy, Harding died suddenly on August 2, 1923, cutting his one term short. Speculation abounded. One theory, that Harding's own wife poisoned him due to the rumored affairs with other women that Harding was known for. Mrs. Harding refused an autopsy, but doctors at the time theorized that the symptoms pointed to congestive heart failure. Harding's widow, Florence, quickly returned to Washington to burn or hide away Harding's papers and personal correspondence in an effort to protect his legacy. However, the corruption and scandal that was exposed after his death has ranked Harding among the worst American presidents. Succeeding the fallen president, Calvin Coolidge was sworn in as the 30th President of the United States on August 2, 1923. His tenure as governor of Massachusetts established Coolidge in the American consciousness as a man of decisive action. His term in office saw the United States align with his own views. Coolidge favored small government, and under his administration, the economy grew rapidly. Commerce expanded. The national debt was reduced. The budget was in surplus. Taxes were lowered significantly, and the federal government shrank both in absolute terms as well as relative to state governments and the growing private sector. When securing the Republican nomination for what would be his first full-term elected president in his own right, Coolidge stated,
"I believe in the American Constitution. I favor the American system of individual enterprise, and I am opposed to any general extension of government ownership and control. I believe not only in advocating economy and public expenditure, but in its practical application and actual accomplishment. I believe in a reduction and a reform of taxation, and shall continue my efforts in that direction.
Coolidge had his work cut out for him in terms of restoring faith in the presidency, especially after the scandal that marred his predecessor's administration and legacy. He managed to enjoy considerable popularity during his term, and the economic expansion and laissez-faire government policies won him favor with both his fellow party members and voters. Though his party urged him to run for a third term in 1928, Coolidge declined, stating,
"The chances of having a wise and faithful public service are increased by a change in the presidential office after a moderate length of time."
Ours is a land rich in resources, stimulating in its glorious beauty, filled with millions of happy homes, blessed with comfort and opportunity. In no nation are the institutions of progress more advanced. In no nation are the fruits of accomplishment more secure. In no nation is the government more worthy of respect. No country is more loved by its people. I have an abiding faith in their capacity, integrity, and high purpose. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope.
Just 8 months after Herbert Hoover was elected the 31st President of the United States, the Wall Street crash of 1929 sent the nation into what became known as the Great Depression. While the president could hardly be blamed for the conditions that led to the crash, millions of Americans suffered poverty, hunger, and homelessness, and the improvised shanty towns that sprung up around the country earned the nickname Hoovervilles. A mining engineer who had made a fortune in that industry, Hoover, like Taft, was nominated despite a lack of electoral experience or high military ranking. He ran on a platform of eliminating waste and inefficiency, though when the Great Depression hit, Hoover was able to adapt quickly, responding with efforts to curb the devastating economical effects. He started public works projects like the Hoover Dam, increased taxes in the top tax bracket, and passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff on imported goods to drive American production and consumption. None of the programs, unfortunately, were successful, but they provided the groundwork later for President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. Hoover even redistributed his presidential salary, something only he and later President John F. Kennedy were known for.
I made up my mind when I entered public life that I would not make it possible for anyone ever to say that I had sought public office for the money there was in it. I therefore kept the money that came to me as salary in a separate account and distributed it where I thought it would do the most good. Part of it went to supplement the salaries of men who worked under me and whom the government paid less than I thought they were worth. Part of it went to charities.
Hoover unsuccessfully ran for a second term in 1932. The failure of his public works programs and his continuing enforcement of prohibition lost favor with voters. And that year, the American people elected a president that would see them through the Great Depression and lead them through another great global war. On March 4th, 1933, a man entered the office of the president that would remain there for over a decade. A man whose battle with polio left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down, but still managed to teach himself to walk with a cane and never let his disability define him. A man that would lift the United States from the deepest of economic depression and see the United States through the most fantastic conflict the country and the world had ever seen. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had become a symbol of the perfect president, for leading America out of the Dust Bowl and into the atomic age. A fifth cousin of previous President Theodore Roosevelt, and born of the same prominent New York City family, one legend has it that James Roosevelt once took his young son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to visit Grover Cleveland in the White House, where the harried president reportedly told the boy,
"I have one wish for you, little man, that you will never be President of the United States."
Cleveland's wish was unfulfilled. Campaigning and winning with the somewhat prophetic song, "Happy Days Are Here Again," the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, wasted no time when he entered office. Within his first 100 days, FDR instituted his New Deal programs, rushing legislation and acts through Congress in an effort to produce relief, such as government jobs for the massively unemployed, recovery through economic growth, and reform through the regulation of Wall Street, the banks, and transportation. For much of Roosevelt's first term, the economy seemed to be on the up and up. However, conditions relapsed into a recession in 1937. The following year would see the invasion of China by Japan and aggressive expansion in Europe by Nazi Germany, leading the world into another war. Roosevelt was determined to limit United States involvement in the early years of World War II, but successfully lobbied Congress to approve a Lend-Lease Act, providing munitions and supplies to United States allies fighting against Nazi Germany with Great Britain, as well as support to China to help fend off their invaders. The programs helped not only the countries fighting in Europe and Asia, but the unemployed in America, who went back to work under government contracts in war centers, manufacturing weapons and vehicles like planes, tanks, and ships for the war effort. It seemed for a moment that the war could be won without leaving American soil. Until December 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us, no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion.
The United States officially entered World War II. While Axis powers were fought on two fronts, the economy at home was mobilized for the war effort. While the industrial economy grew and unemployment dropped, Roosevelt saw partisan politics in Congress reverse many of the New Deal programs he had established. Surviving programs include Social Security and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which insured private and corporate bank accounts from total loss in the event of bank closure or another depression. As the war continued, so did Roosevelt's presidency. He was elected to the office a total of 4 times, more than any other president before or since, and his work shaped liberal politics for decades. After his 4th term officially began in 1945, FDR had just returned from the Yalta Conference, where post-war planning was taking place, and where Roosevelt's health continued to decline. When he spoke of the conference to Congress on March 1st, it was clear from his thin, frail appearance and the fact that he was seated during his address that the president was not long for this world. At the end of that month, FDR suffered a stroke while sitting for a portrait by the artist Elizabeth Shumatoff. Roosevelt died that day, and the portrait remained famously unfinished, just as were, sadly, Roosevelt's efforts in World War II. It was then left to Roosevelt's vice president, Harry Truman, to see an end to the global conflict. With German surrender looming, yet no end in sight in the Pacific Theater, Truman entered office with many uneasy decisions to be made. Since 1939, research and development had taken place in the top-secret research lab at Los Alamos on a new type of bomb, more powerful than previously conceived. The stopping power of this device was initially developed in response to intelligence of a similar Nazi program, but now it appeared the Pacific Theater was the place to employ the atomic bomb. Join us next time as we look at the close of World War II, the presidency of Harry Truman, and the remaining United States presidents in their journeys from politics to power.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.